On July 17, 2014, two completely different events were unfolding over eastern Ukraine. 33,000 feet above the ground, a passenger jet carrying 298 people was cruising toward Asia. Far below, soldiers in the middle of a brutal conflict were operating powerful air defense weapons. But within minutes, those two worlds would collide, and the result would become one of the most controversial aviation disasters in modern history. Initially, investigators believed it to be an unusual disaster. But for weapons experts, the debris told a very specific story. The aircraft wasn't simply crashed, it was shot down. But one crucial detail remains unknown. Who actually pressed the launch button? This is the spine-chilling true story of Malaysia Airlines Flight MH17 that explains how unpredictable life is. On a summer afternoon, at around 12:31 p.m. local time, Malaysia Airlines Flight MH17 lifted off from Amsterdam's Schiphol Airport. The aircraft was headed for Kuala Lumpur. For the 298 people on board, it was just the start of a long journey. Some passengers were traveling to attend a major AIDS research conference in Australia. Others were families returning home after summer vacations across Europe. There were students, parents, children, and for everyone on board, it was meant to be an ordinary flight. Thousands of commercial aircraft had used this route before. But on that day, the skies above eastern Ukraine were anything but ordinary. Far below the aircraft, a war was unfolding. Heavy weapons were now appearing on both sides of the battlefield. The region had become a battleground. A conflict, known as the War in Donbass, had been raging for months between Ukrainian government forces and Russian-backed separatists, and the skies above the battlefield were becoming increasingly dangerous. Yet, commercial airlines continued flying overhead, because at 33,000 feet, passenger aircraft were believed to be safely out of reach. But just minutes later, air traffic controllers would suddenly lose contact with the aircraft. Inside the air traffic control center, the afternoon was calm, and they were busy guiding dozens of aircraft that day. Among them was Malaysia Airlines Flight 17. The weather was normal, and there were no signs of any error. But suddenly, at 4:19 p.m., MH17 vanished from the radar. At first, controllers assumed that it was a normal glitch. They immediately tried to contact the pilots. But there was no response. Even no distress call or emergency message was received. Within seconds, one of the busiest air corridors in Europe had lost contact with a passenger aircraft carrying 298 people. What had been a routine flight had turned into a mystery. On the ground of eastern Ukraine, residents heard explosions around them. It appeared usual due to the ongoing war already happening nearby, but moments later, pieces of burning metal began falling from the sky. Large pieces of the MH17 plane crashed into fields and roads across Donetsk Oblast. Columns of thick black smoke appeared from multiple nearby areas. Fragments of the fuselage scattered across miles of farmland. Within hours of the crash, international investigators arrived at the scene to examine the wreckage. Because most of the passengers were Dutch citizens, the investigation was led by the Dutch Safety Board. Meanwhile, the criminal investigation was handled by the Multinational Joint Investigation Team. Investigators found that the aircraft had broken apart in midair, and all 298 people on board were killed instantly. Luggage, toys, and personal belongings were scattered across the crash site. At that moment, no one knew what had caused the disaster, but the wreckage would soon change the direction of the investigation. When forensic specialists started examining the debris, they immediately found something unusual. One of the key figures overseeing the investigation was Dutch prosecutor Fred Westerbeek. The cockpit had hundreds of small puncture holes, as if thousands of high-speed metallic fragments had hit it. To aviation experts, this pattern was recognizable. These were not the signs of any mechanical failure. But they were exhibiting the probability of a missile explosion, indicating that the aircraft was not simply crashed, but had been destroyed. Investigations of the fragment pieces hinted at a powerful air defense weapon known as the Buk surface-to-air missile system. The system uses radar to track aircraft and launch missiles capable of destroying a target within seconds. The butterfly-shaped metal fragments from the missiles would explode outward from their target at a greater speed. Identifying the weapon only raised a much larger question. Where did it launch from? Without wasting time, investigators immediately started tracing where the missile had come from. This is where an unusual group of investigators began playing a major role. Researchers from Bellingcat started analyzing satellite visuals and photographs posted on social media in eastern Ukraine. Bellingcat founder Elliot Higgins began analyzing satellite images and social media posts and revealed a surprising pattern. The Bellingcat team discovered that the vehicle was traveling through territory controlled by pro-Russian separatist forces. Surprisingly, later photographs showed the same launcher heading back towards the Russian border. But throughout this transportation incident, there was a crucial difference. One of the missiles that the vehicle was carrying that day was missing. These findings would later support the official conclusions of the Joint Investigation Team. The investigations believed that the missile belonged to 53rd Brigade of the Russian military unit based in the city of Kursk. But identifying the missile launcher was only a part of the puzzle, because someone still had to fire it. After the crash investigation, another war began, but not on the battlefield. It was about information. Russian officials denied any involvement in the Malaysian Airlines MH17 flight disaster. TASS, the Russia-based news agency, began publishing alternative explanations for the disaster. Some reports claimed that a Ukrainian jet hit the aircraft, while others suggested that the pilots, crews, and passengers were already dead before the crash happened. Another theory indicated that the plane was actually the missing Malaysia Airlines Flight 370. But the European monitoring project EU versus Disinfo registered over 400 separate disinformation cases related to MH17. In the hours after the crash, a senior separatist commander, Igor Girkin, posted a message on Russian social media about shooting down an aircraft. At the time, pro-Russian forces in eastern Ukraine had been targeting Ukrainian military transport aircraft. But within hours, the situation became clear. The aircraft that had been destroyed was not a military transport, it was Malaysia Airlines Flight 17. Soon after, the post disappeared and Girkin started denying any involvement. But by then, screenshots of the original message had already begun circulating across the internet. Gradually, the case became a turning point and went beyond usual aviation accidents. It showed how misinformation campaigns could even operate on a global scale. Even when this information war was intensified, another uncomfortable question emerged. Why was MH17 flying over a war zone? When the disaster happened, Ukraine restricted flights to fly below 32,000 feet in the conflict zone. But commercial airlines, including Malaysia Airlines Flight MH17, were still allowed to cruise above that altitude. They didn't know that this decision could take more than 200 lives at once, while they expected a safe journey. For airlines, the route over eastern Ukraine had become an important corridor. Flying over Ukrainian airspace was cheaper than using Russian routes. And this system helped the authority to generate over $200 million per year. Before the disaster, roughly 150 international flights per day were crossing Ukrainian airspace. The route had become a busy aerial highway connecting Europe and Asia. But when the missile struck Malaysia Airlines Flight 17, that aerial highway closed almost instantly. While many new leads appeared for the MH17 tragedy, another political debate started that gave a new angle to the investigation. It was a comparison that was particularly uncomfortable for the US audience. In 1988, during the tensions in the Persian Gulf, a United States Navy warship, the USS Vincennes CG-49, mistakenly shot down a civilian plane, Iran Air Flight 655. As a result, all 290 people on board were immediately killed. Investigation discovered that the crew of the Vincennes had misidentified the Airbus A300 as a hostile military aircraft. Later, the United States financially compensated the victims' families, but they never formally apologized and admitted legal liability. Things turned more intense when the ship's captain, Will Rogers III, later received a military commendation. Over the years, Russians have officially used this incident when asked about the MH17 disaster. For them, it became a common example of what is known as whataboutism. It was a rhetorical tactic that redirects criticism by pointing to another controversial event. But inside this argument, there was a bigger difference that many people don't know. The Vincennes incident was the result of a misidentification, but the destruction of MH17 was something else. In the MH17 case, investigations proved that the missile system responsible was secretly transported into a foreign war zone, used, and then transported back. Understanding the difference is important as it brings the investigation back to the most troubling question of all. If the missile system came from outside the battlefield, then who was actually operating it? Investigators eventually discovered the missile launcher and its journey on the day of the disaster. They traced down the individuals connected to the transport of the system. But one mystery remains difficult to answer. Who actually pressed the launch button? Systems like Buk surface-to-air missiles require trained crews, and many soldiers would have been involved in the operation. But the exact identity of the person who fired the missile remains uncertain. The person who pressed the launch button was almost certainly a trained Russian military professional from the 53rd Brigade. They operate under orders and under a system with limited radar context. Every psychological and technical indicator suggests they believed they were firing at a military target. Even after decades, victims' families have multiple questions that need to be answered to end their long-lasting suffering. Behind this question mark on the unknown soldier lies one of the pivotal reasons: Russia. The key problem is access to information, and Russia has consistently refused to accept responsibility. Since the disaster, the officials have prevented investigators from gathering evidence from Russian nationals. The destruction of Malaysia Airlines Flight 17 was not just an aviation disaster. It was a tragedy fueled by war, politics, and information warfare. For decades, investigators documented every single strand, but some answers remain locked behind political silence. 298 lives were lost in a matter of seconds, and the mystery of the unknown soldier still lingers in the skies above eastern Ukraine. This is MayDay Central with yet another untold aviation mystery.